Many events in history require taking perspective into consideration. For example, many lower-class citizens see welfare as a great government service that helps struggling families out of poverty, while lots of upper-class conservatives see it as government giving away money to lazy or needy people. Every story has two sides to it and multiple perspectives to use when looking at the events of our shared history. Right now, we're viewing two different men from separate historical times who took certain measures for a cause they believe in, and it's up to us to decide if they are heroes or villains of history by looking at them from different perspectives.
Before we try to classify someone as a hero or a villain, we must first define the terms. Webster's dictionary defines a hero as a person who is admired for their great acts or fine qualities, and a villain as someone who does bad things or is blamed for certain problems and difficulties. We asked each person that we interviewed to define each term in their own words.
History of Americans.
I think our villains or heroes go back to our childhood. I think that, we watch Disney when we have this idea of who the good guys are and the bad guys are, and we try to have everything fit into that mold. So we know that good guys do good things and bad guys do bad things.
A villain is somebody that you don't like. A hero is someone that you do like. And it all depends on what they do, what time period you're talking about.
A villain, generally I would just call that person like the bad guy.
The first person of history that we're reviewing is Osama bin Laden, the man responsible for the Al-Qaeda terror network and the September 11th attacks on America in 2001. His rise to power began in the 1980s, when he became a chief financier for the resistance against the Soviet Union, and in 1988 he formed Al-Qaeda, which was originally created to provide information to the families of missing Afghan soldiers. In 1990, a year after the Soviets left Afghanistan, U.S. troops were sent to Saudi Arabia for protection against Iraqi invasions. The United States was seen as a Christian country, which was considered deplorable or unacceptable around the holy grounds of Mecca and Medina. This angered Osama bin Laden, so he and his group moved to Sudan, where Al-Qaeda became more of a terror organization set on ridding Saudi Arabia of American influences. Bin Laden felt betrayed by the country of Saudi Arabia, and felt that American soldiers shouldn't be allowed on the country's holy land, and that he needed to act on this. In February of 1993, a bomb exploded at the World Trade Center in New York City, which only killed 6 people but injured hundreds. 6 radical Muslim suspects were later convicted for this bombing and were suspected to have links to bin Laden, who was named as a co-conspirator at this event. About 8 months later, 18 American servicemen who were on a mission in Somalia were ambushed and killed in Mogadishu, causing the U.S. to leave Somalia. Bin Laden admitted that the people who ambushed were Arab Afghans, and called Americans paper tigers because of their withdrawal. In 1994, bin Laden's Saudi citizenship was taken away, freezing all of his assets, and his own family disowned him. The same year, someone made a failed attempt to assassinate him, causing him to strengthen his personal security. He later funded a series of attacks in different places, including an attempted bombing in Bangkok, the destruction of a shrine in Mashhad, Iran, and a suicide bombing at the Egyptian embassy in Pakistan. In August of 1996, bin Laden declared a holy war against the United States by signing and issuing a declaration called Message from Osama bin Laden to his Muslim brothers in the whole world, and especially the Arabian Peninsula, Declaration of Jihad against the Americans occupying the land of the 2 holy mosques, expel the heretics from the Arabian Peninsula. In 1997, he had his first public interview, where he says that the United States is unjust, criminal, and tyrannical.
The U.S. today has set a double standard, calling whoever goes against its injustice a terrorist. It wants to occupy our countries, steal our resources, impose agents on us to rule us, and then wants us to agree to all this. If we refuse to do so, it says we are terrorists.
In August of 1998, U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were attacked by truck bombs, killing 224 people, and bin Laden was charged by the U.S. for the murders of each individual victim. His first appearance on the FBI's Most Wanted Fugitives list was in June of 1999. In 2000, shortly after the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen, Ahmed Razan pled guilty for plotting to bomb the Los Angeles International Airport, saying that he was trained at a camp that was run by Osama bin Laden. On Tuesday, September 11th of 2001, one of the biggest terror attacks in modern history occurred. Starting at 8:45 a.m., a plane loaded with 20,000 gallons of jet fuel collided into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City, leaving a giant burning hole at the 80th story of the building. 18 minutes later, a second plane crashed around the South Tower's 60th floor, causing an explosion that left debris on the streets and surrounding buildings. An hour after the first plane crash in New York City, another plane crashed into the west side of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., killing a total of 189 people. At 10 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed, and 30 minutes later, the North Tower followed suit. About 10,000 people were injured, and only 6 people survived the collapse. At around the same time of the Twin Towers' collapse, a westbound plane from New Jersey was hijacked and crashed into a field in Pennsylvania, killing all 45 people aboard the flight. The number of deaths in all 3 of these attacks totaled to 2,996. Soon after, bin Laden became a wanted fugitive, dead or alive, with a $25 million bounty. For 10 years, American soldiers fought in the Middle East, searching for the despised al-Qaeda leader, until May of 2011, when a group of Navy SEALs killed bin Laden in the process of a firefight in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Using various opinions and historical evidence, we've classified Osama bin Laden as a villain rather than a hero. When we asked whether bin Laden was a hero or a villain, everyone that we interviewed gave the same answer.
Obviously, from our perspective, he's a villain. He killed well, not directly, but influenced the deaths of over 2,000, almost 3,000 people, 3,000 Americans. So obviously he's a villain. He stood up for what he believed in, obviously. A religious conviction, even that he wanted to get the infidels out of the Middle East. However, I think that his extremism takes him from even being marginally a hero and makes him definitely a villain. However, obviously that question being posed to somebody that was a Sunni Muslim would totally think something different. But from Christian America, he's a villain.
When we think of a villain, we normally think of someone in a movie whose motive is to take over the world or for revenge, but that's not always the case in history. Many historical villains are driven by their own self-interest rather than the greater good of their country or people, like Adolf Hitler, Kim Jong-un, or Joseph Stalin. A common trait found in villains is the killings or deaths of innocent people. Osama bin Laden was responsible for taking thousands of innocent lives in an attempt to get American troops out of the Muslims' Holy Land. He was responsible for taking over 3,000 lives during attacks in America and hundreds in other countries, along with his funding and aid towards multiple wars and massacres that ended with thousands of casualties. Another common trait found in villains is their great amount of power. Though this is a trait that many heroes have, a villain usually gains their power through fear or violence. Bin Laden and al-Qaeda used many tactics, including threats, bombings, and hostages, to become feared by millions around the world, thus giving them more power.
And in history will tell you, as I reflect on history, I think about Hitler, folks along those lines. A lot of people felt as if Hitler was an awesome leader. And with good leaders, people follow them. Good or bad. But Osama bin Laden, his message has been communicated in a number of different ways. Based on readings from news media outlets, from an international standpoint and from an American standpoint, it's going to be skewed views. From an international standpoint, let's just say within the Middle East, many people may perceive Osama as an awesome leader, a great person, because he stood up for what he felt as if was right. And that's why sometimes people tend to follow him. But from an American standpoint, based on some things that, for instance, let's just talk about 9/11, he would be considered a really bad person for harming innocent folks with the World Trade Center bombing.
Though bin Laden was supported and praised by many radical Muslims for his actions, we're making our last point by comparing the progress towards al-Qaeda's goals with the damage that they did. and much of their actions and measures were relatively minor and did not make much progress until the early 2000s. Though they made a bit of progress with attacks directed towards the U.S., American troops weren't withdrawn until literally 10 years after their first attack on America. Due to these comparisons and considerations, we've come to a final conclusion that Osama bin Laden is a villain of history. The next person that we're reviewing is Samuel Adams, leader and co-founder of the Sons of Liberty and a historical icon for the American Revolution. Before we discuss the story and actions of Samuel Adams, let's go back and talk about the Sons of Liberty and their actions in general. The Sons of Liberty were formed in August of 1765, just months after the Stamp Act was placed on the colonies. Their initial purpose was to compel the colonies' stamp agents to resign, which would eventually discontinue the act and cause its repeal. The Sons of Liberty's movement included many violent actions and protests, including tar and feathering and the destruction of private property, which was publicly acclaimed by colonists who called them the only guardians and protectors of the rights and liberties of America. The group's first major action took place on August 14, 1765, shortly after they were formed. They met under the Liberty Tree, a tree used for hanging and burning effigies, to pair an effigy of Andrew Oliver, a stamp officer, with a sign that said, "He that takes this down is an enemy to the country." The Sons marched through Boston with the effigy on display, encouraging rebellion against British taxes, and at the end of the riot, they ended up decapitating, stomping, and burning the effigy, and made their way to Andrew Oliver's home with destructive intentions. They tore down his fence, smashed the windows of his house, destroyed some of his belongings, and looted his house, and Oliver didn't even take part of the Stamp Act. He was just an easy target of attack for the Sons of Liberty. But the Sons got what they wanted. Oliver publicly resigned 2 days later, and the following December he swore on oath that he wouldn't be a stamp officer again. The Sons' next action took place literally the day after they raided Andrew Oliver's home, this time targeting Thomas Hutchinson, who was the Lieutenant Governor and Chief of Justice of Massachusetts, also a known loyalist. His popularity to the public did not have a positive connotation since he had publicly condemned the revolts of colonists before. The group blockaded the public figure's mansion and demanded him to use his power and authority to condemn the Stamp Act in his letters to London, England. When Hutchinson refused, they responded 11 days later by raiding, destroying, and looting his home. At the end of the night, 900 British sterling was stolen from him, which would be worth $34,531 American dollars today, along with $2,200 worth of damage. Hutchinson later received $3,000 in British sterling for reimbursement, which wouldn't completely make up for the damage in stolen goods. The original Boston Sons of Liberty inspired many other patriots throughout the 13 colonies to form their own Sons of Liberty groups in places like Virginia, the Carolinas, and the New England colonies, none of which could compare to the original group, but still fueled the Revolution. The Sons continued to fuel rebellion and protest throughout the colonies, and on December 16th of 1773, they performed what was one of the most significant events leading to the Revolution, the Boston Tea Party. On the day of the Boston Tea Party, members of the Sons of Liberty arrived at the Boston Harbor disguised as Mohawk Native Americans, boarded 3 ships, and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. A few months later, the American Revolution began, the Sons of Liberty as major catalysts. Samuel Adams helped form the Sons of Liberty and was recognized as the primary leader of the group and usually led the group in their actions of protest or rebellion. He was the main person responsible for the violent actions of the group, and was even the one who brought to the table the idea of using violence to compel change within the colonies and government. Osama bin Laden and Samuel Adams are similar in the way that they used violent acts for a cause that they felt was appropriate for. Both used their groups as networks to encourage certain changes within their countries. Even though Samuel Adams didn't do nearly as much damage to others as Osama bin Laden, they both made virtually the same decisions. The only difference that us as viewers of history have created is what their actions were in favor of. With a point of view that sees Samuel Adams and Osama bin Laden in a more similar light, the only thing we have to distinguish each other is one factor: the greater good of the people.
I think that we create heroes and villains based on how they live their life, and most importantly, how they affect people. So if you affect a great number of people in a positive way, you tend to be a hero, and if you affect a greater number of people in a negative way, you tend to be a villain.
We're classifying Samuel Adams as a hero because despite the violent things that he'd led the Sons of Liberty to do, it was for the greater good of the rest of the colonies. When Osama bin Laden took action, he was only doing so for his own self-interest, rather than doing what was actually best for the country. He killed innocent people for the sake of his own beliefs. His own family and even his country disowned him because of his actions. Samuel Adams was a hero because his actions were making progress towards gaining independence for his country, freeing the colonies of oppression from England, even if it involved violent acts of destruction towards opposers. In conclusion, even though they have their similarities, it all came down to the greater good of the people. Samuel Adams was doing right by the people of the colonies. Despite the fact that it included hurting people and damaging property, it pushed the 13 colonies to become the country that it is today. Osama bin Laden took irrational measures for his own ideas and self-interest, making him more of a villain of history. Rather than remaining peaceful and non-violently protesting against the issue, he took matters into his own hands by killing thousands of innocent people and encouraging violence as a medium for protest. Through lots of research and interviews, we came to the conclusion that deciding if someone is a hero or a villain all comes down to what's good for the people, and not just particular qualities that society looks for.
Shutterstock Music.
Heroes and villains in our shared history as Americans.
Who's a hero?
Many events in history require taking perspective and perspectives to use when looking at the events of our shared history.
Start because they don't mess us up.
I mean, you just messed it up, didn't you? For example, measures for a cause. And it's Taylor, I was doing so good. Many lower class citizens see welfare as a great government service. Villain, leave.
Wait, now I have to reposition the thing.
Require taking perspective into consideration. Taylor, I can't. Melanie, don't do that.
Go outside. Okay, very serious.
Pause and start. Many events.
Alright, you know what?
Christina, get out that chair.